The coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Monsieur Laurent Guidry had taken his morning ritual on the eastern gallery of his plantation home at precisely 6 o'clock every morning for the past 11 years. Same chair. Same view across the property line toward the convent of the Sacred Mercy. Same rhythm of sipping chicory-laced coffee while the Louisiana sun bled orange across the flat delta landscape. This was supposed to be an ordinary Thursday in late April of 1846. Humid air, already thick enough to taste, mosquitoes whining their hungry song, the distant clang of the chapel bell calling the sisters to lauds drifting through the curtain of Spanish moss that hung from the live oaks separating his land from theirs. But nothing about what he was seeing felt ordinary. Sister Marie-Therese moved through the herb garden with the same measured grace she displayed for years, her black habit stark against the green tangle of basil and thyme. But her silhouette had changed. The fabric that should have hung straight from shoulder to hem now curved outward at her midsection in a way that made Guidry's throat tighten. He set the cup down on the wrought iron table beside him, the porcelain clinking louder than he intended in the thick morning air. He told himself it was the angle. The way the early light played tricks through humidity so dense it turned the world soft and uncertain. He told himself it was the cut of her habit, perhaps altered recently for comfort in the relentless heat that turned skin slick and made breathing feel like swallowing water. He told himself anything except what his eyes were insisting he acknowledge. Sister Marie-Therese bent to examine something at the base of a tomato plant, and the movement confirmed what he'd been trying to deny. The roundness wasn't fabric. It wasn't shadow. It was flesh, unmistakable in its shape and implication. A bead of sweat traced down Guidry's temple that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was a meticulous man, a planter who'd built his fortune on attention to detail and the ability to spot problems before they became catastrophes. He knew what he was looking at. He'd seen his wife carry 3 children. He'd observed enough enslaved women in the quarters move through pregnancy to recognize the particular way a body changes when new life grows inside it. But this was impossible. These were consecrated women, brides of Christ. They'd taken vows that placed them outside the realm of such earthly concerns. The very foundation of their existence rested on renunciation of the flesh, on a spiritual purity that elevated them above the messy biology that governed ordinary women. Through the trees, he could make out movement near the convent's eastern wall. Another sister, he couldn't identify which one from this distance, paused in the courtyard, and even from 200 yards away, her silhouette told the same impossible story. The habit pulled taut across a belly that protruded in a way no amount of prayer or fasting could explain. The chapel bell ceased its ringing, leaving only the buzz of insects and the wet sound of humidity dripping from leaf to leaf in the unnatural silence that followed. A woodpecker hammered against a cypress tree somewhere in the swamp beyond the convent grounds, the rhythm frantic and mindless. Guidry picked up his coffee again but didn't drink. The liquid had gone lukewarm, a film forming on its surface. His hand trembled slightly, making tiny ripples spread across the dark brew. He was a practical man. A man who dealt in facts, soil quality, crop yields, the market price of sugar in New Orleans, the cost of maintaining property, and the humans who worked it. He didn't traffic in gossip or speculation. But what he'd just witnessed demanded verification, even though every instinct told him that verification would only confirm what he desperately wanted to dismiss as misperception. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that some truths are better left unexamined, that there are cracks in the world's order we're meant to step over rather than peer into, that powerful institutions, the church, the plantation system, the entire social fabric of Louisiana, depended on certain fictions remaining unchallenged. But Monsieur Laurent Guidry had seen what he'd seen, and as he sat in the gathering heat of that April morning, watching Sister Marie-Therese disappear into the shadows of the convent's covered walkway. He understood with absolute certainty that he was staring at the visible edge of something the Church had buried so deep that its exposure would shake the foundations of faith itself. He would need to verify it, to speak carefully to the right people, to confirm that his eyes hadn't deceived him, though a cold, sinking part of him already knew they hadn't. Before we continue with the story, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from anywhere in the Deep South, or from any corner of this country where hidden histories still whisper through the walls of old buildings, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This channel survives because of listeners like you who hunger for the truth that history tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has never been told in full. And stories like this deserve to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. The sisters moved through matins like water flowing along a channel worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Rise at 4:30 in absolute darkness. Dress in silence. Process down the narrow wooden stairs that creaked despite their careful steps, each footfall a whispered prayer in itself. Enter the chapel where candlelight threw their shadows long and wavering against whitewashed walls. Kneel. Begin the ancient rhythm of psalms and responses that had been chanted by consecrated women since long before Louisiana existed, since before ships carried Europeans and Africans to this swampy edge of empire. Mother Superior Therese Barron watched from her place at the front, her spine rigid as the cypress beams overhead, her hands folded in perfect stillness. At 52, she'd maintained this routine for 3 decades. She knew every rhythm, every breath, every subtle variation in how her sisters moved through these sacred hours. Which was precisely why she noticed when Sister Genevieve lost her breath during the lauds. It happened during the Benedictus, that moment of praise when voices should have lifted clear and strong. But Sister Genevieve's voice faltered, cut short by what sounded like a gasp. Her hand moved unconsciously to her side, pressing against her ribs as if something within her had shifted and now pressed against bone in ways that made breathing difficult. Mother Superior kept her eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar, but her attention had narrowed to laser focus on the women kneeling behind her. She'd been noticing these small disruptions for weeks now. Sister Marie Claire adjusting her habit during prime, pulling at fabric that should have hung loose but now seemed to bind. Sister Angelique moving more slowly than usual when rising from genuflection, one hand braced against the pew as if her center of gravity had shifted. And then there was Sister Marie-Therese, who'd taken to working the gardens in the earliest hours of morning when mist still clung to the ground and no one else stirred, as if she were trying to complete her tasks before anyone could observe her changing form in full daylight. The chapel filled with the scent of beeswax and incense, overlaid with something else Mother Superior couldn't quite name, a faint sourness that suggested bodies under strain, the particular smell of women whose flesh was betraying the vows their souls had made. When lauds concluded, and the sisters filed out in single procession toward the refectory for their silent breakfast, Mother Superior remained behind. She knelt before the altar, her knees pressing hard against the wooden kneeler, and tried to pray. But the words that usually flowed automatic and comforting now stuck in her throat like stones. She'd built her entire life on order, on the belief that discipline and devotion could create a space apart from the world's chaos, where women could serve God without the complications of flesh and desire that plagued ordinary existence. Sacred mercy was supposed to be exactly what its name promised, a sanctuary where mercy flowed from the divine, where earthly concerns dissolved in the presence of the eternal. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. In the kitchen, Helene moved through her morning preparations with the efficiency of 6 decades spent in service. At 63, her hands knew every task without conscious thought, building the fire in the great hearth, setting water to boil, measuring out the grits and salt that would form the sisters' simple meal. She was reaching for the washing basin when she noticed it. Cloth bundled in the corner, half hidden behind a sack of dried beans. She pulled it out, expecting laundry that Margot had forgotten to collect. But the fabric was stiff with dried blood. Not the small spots that might come from a minor cut or a woman's monthly bleeding, but substantial staining that spoke of something more significant. Helene's hands stilled. She'd delivered more babies than she could count in the slave quarters across 3 plantations over 4 decades. She knew the signs. The particular smell of amniotic fluid. The way blood looked when it came from childbirth rather than injury. The type of cloths used to clean up after a delivery. This was that kind of cloth. She rewrapped it quickly and shoved it back where she'd found it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. She'd noticed the changes in some of the sisters, had watched Sister Genevieve's body thicken, had seen how Sister Marie Claire now moved with a particular waddle of advanced pregnancy. But she'd told herself it was impossible. That she was seeing patterns where none existed. That consecrated women lived in a different realm where such earthly concerns couldn't touch them. The blood-stained cloth mocked that delusion. Outside the kitchen window, the morning light strengthened, burning off the mist and revealing the grounds in harsh clarity. Helene could see the path that led from the main building to the dependencies, the tool shed, the laundry, and beyond them, barely visible through the screen of live oaks, the small cabin where Matthias lived in isolation. She'd delivered babies for 40 years. She knew what happened when women became pregnant. She knew it required a man. And there was only one man on the entire property. In the refectory, the sisters ate their grits in perfect silence, spoons scraping against tin bowls in rhythm. Mother Superior Therese Barron sat at the head table, her own bowl untouched, her eyes moving from face to face as if searching for confirmation of what she already suspected. Through the window, she could see the garden path, the same path Sister Marie-Therese walked every morning. The same path that led, if one followed it far enough through the cypress grove, to where Matthias lived apart from the community he served. Mother Superior's hands clenched in her lap beneath the table where no one could see them tremble. She'd been telling herself for months that she was imagining problems. That the sisters were simply suffering from the Louisiana climate, from seasonal illnesses, from the dozens of mundane explanations that could account for changes in appetite and energy and body shape. But denial had its limits. And Mother Superior Therese Barron had just reached hers. What she dreaded, what she'd been refusing to acknowledge, was no longer unfolding in some uncertain future. It had already happened, was happening still, and the truth of it sat at her breakfast table, hidden beneath black habits and bowed heads, growing larger and more undeniable with every passing day. The confessional booth smelled of old wood and decades of whispered sins. Monsieur Laurent Guidry knelt in the narrow space, his knees pressed against the worn cushion, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Through the latticed screen separating him from Father Dominique Roussel, he could see the priest's profile, nose prominent, shoulders slumped with the weight of 73 years and countless secrets absorbed through this very partition. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The words came automatically, but what followed stuck in Guidry's throat like swamp mud. How did a man confess to suspecting the impossible? How did he voice concerns that, if proven true, would shatter everything the community believed about the holiness dwelling 3 miles north of town? "Father, I've noticed something troubling at the convent." He chose each word carefully, testing the ground like a man crossing a bog where one wrong step meant drowning. "Several of the sisters appear to be suffering from some manner of illness. A swelling condition. It affects their midsections." Through the screen, Father Roussel shifted. The movement produced a series of small creaks from his side of the booth. "The climate here is difficult for women of delicate constitution," the priest said, his voice carrying the flat effect of a man who'd heard every possible human failing and had stopped being surprised decades ago. The humidity causes all manner of complaints. Swelling. Digestive troubles. The ague takes many forms. Father, with respect, this seems different. Monsieur Guidry. The priest's tone sharpened slightly. Are you suggesting something improper about women who have dedicated their lives to Christ? Because such thoughts are themselves a form of sin. To look upon consecrated religious with suspicion, to allow your mind to wander toward explanations that would be. He paused, searching for the word. Blasphemous. That is the greater danger here. Guidry's jaw tightened. He'd expected resistance, but the speed with which Father Roussel had shut down the conversation felt less like spiritual guidance and more like willful blindness. I only thought perhaps someone should check on their welfare. A doctor, perhaps, to ensure. Mother Superior Therese Baron is more than capable of managing the health of her community, Father Roussel interrupted. She would inform me if pastoral intervention were required. Your concern is noted, my son, but I believe it stems from an overactive imagination rather than genuine cause for alarm. Say 3 Hail Marys and ask the Virgin to grant you peace of mind. The dismissal was absolute. Guidry remained kneeling for a moment longer, staring at the latticed screen that separated him from a man who'd chosen comfort over investigation. Finally, he murmured the expected response, crossed himself, and backed out of the confessional into the dim sanctuary of the Church of St. Martin Delaware Tours. Outside, the afternoon heat wrapped around him like a wet blanket. He'd done what conscience demanded, raised the alarm with the appropriate authority. If Father Roussel chose to ignore it, that absolved Guidry of further responsibility. At least, that's what he told himself as he mounted his horse and rode back toward his plantation, trying to ignore the knot of unease that had settled in his gut like a stone. Inside Sacred Mercy, Sister Genevieve pressed both hands against her lower back and tried to focus on the words of Sext. The midday prayer should have been routine, psalms she'd recited thousands of times, responses that flowed without conscious thought. But pain kept interrupting her concentration, sharp cramps that radiated from her pelvis through her entire torso in waves that left her breathless. She'd been experiencing these sensations for 3 days now. At first, she'd convinced herself they were nothing. Indigestion from the beans at supper, perhaps, or the monthly bleeding that had been absent for months but might be returning with particular violence. But the pain was intensifying, coming in rhythms that felt purposeful rather than random. Beside her, Sister Angelique noticed the way Genevieve's hands trembled on her prayer book. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Angelique to see the fear swimming in Genevieve's gaze before both women quickly looked away. They couldn't speak. The rule of silence during canonical hours was absolute. But Angelique's hand moved slightly, fingertips brushing against Genevieve's sleeve in a gesture so brief it might have been accidental. A moment of contact that said, I see you. I know. I'm terrified too. Because Angelique was 4 months behind Genevieve in the same impossible condition. And Sister Marie-Claire was 3 months behind her. And Sister Marie-Therese before all of them. The arithmetic of their shared transgression had created a timeline of consequence that would unfold over the coming months with the inevitability of seasons. When Sext concluded and the sisters filed out, Genevieve moved more slowly than the others, one hand braced against the chapel wall. She could feel something shifting inside her, a pressure building that her body seemed determined to release despite her silent pleading for it to wait, to give her time to understand what was happening, to prepare for whatever came next. That night, Compline stretched into an agony of endurance. The chapel felt smaller than usual, the air thick and difficult to breathe. The oil lamps flickering along the walls cast shadows that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Genevieve's contractions. because that's what they were now, unmistakably. Not cramps. Not indigestion. The ancient machinery of birth grinding into motion despite occurring in a place specifically designed to exist outside such biological imperatives. Sister Marie-Therese, kneeling 3 rows behind Genevieve, watched the younger woman's shoulders hunch with each wave of pain. She'd experienced her own labor 7 months earlier in this very chapel, though hers had waited until after Compline to begin in earnest. She recognized every sign of what Genevieve was enduring, and she knew with absolute certainty that the night ahead would be long and terrible, and would leave sacred mercy permanently altered. When the final prayer concluded and the great silence of night officially began, the sisters processed toward their cells in single file. Genevieve climbed the stairs one agonizing step at a time, her breath coming in short gasps she tried desperately to muffle. She made it to her cell, closed the door, locked it from inside with trembling fingers. And then the pain intensified beyond anything she'd experienced before, a tearing sensation that felt like her body was being split open from within. She bit down on her sleeve to stifle the scream, tasted the wool mixed with her own saliva and terror. But the scream came anyway. A sharp, piercing cry that cut through the great silence like a blade through cloth, raw and animal and utterly human in its expression of agony beyond endurance. 2 cells away, Sister Angelique bolted upright in her narrow bed. Across the hall, Sister Marie-Claire's door flew open. They moved simultaneously toward Genevieve's cell, their bare feet silent on the wooden floor, their habits hastily thrown over their night shifts. Angelique reached the door first and tried the handle. Locked. "Genevieve," she hissed through the wood, her voice barely above a whisper but urgent with panic. "Open the door, please. We can help." Another cry, this one muffled as if Genevieve had stuffed fabric in her mouth to silence herself. Marie-Claire pressed her ear against the door, listening to the sounds coming from within. Ragged breathing, the creak of the bed frame, a low moan that vibrated with the particular frequency of a woman's body doing work it was designed for, but that this woman had vowed would never be required of her. "We need Mother Superior," Marie-Claire whispered. "No." Angelique's response came immediate and fierce. "Not yet. If we wake the others, if everyone knows." "Everyone is going to know regardless," Marie-Claire hissed back. "This isn't something we can hide. Not anymore." Behind them, at the far end of the hallway, another door opened. Mother Superior Therese Barron emerged like a shadow, her face pale in the dim light of the single oil lamp that burned at the top of the stairs. She'd been lying awake, as she'd lain awake most nights for the past 6 months, waiting for exactly this moment she'd been dreading. She moved down the hallway with terrible purpose, her keys jangling softly at her waist. When she reached Genevieve's door, she didn't ask permission. She simply inserted the master key, turned it, and pushed the door open. The scene inside would be seared into her memory until the day she died. Sister Genevieve on her narrow bed, night shift soaked with sweat and other fluids, legs drawn up, face contorted with pain and effort, and the awful realization that what was happening to her could no longer be denied or delayed or prayed away. Mother Superior's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of 3 decades. "Fetch Helene. Now. And wake no one else." Helene moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, her old knees protesting the pace but her hands steady with purpose. She'd been summoned from sleep by Sister Angelique's frantic whisper at her door. "Come quickly, please, it's Sister Genevieve," and she'd known immediately what awaited her. She'd suspected for months, had seen the signs, had kept her knowledge locked behind her teeth because speaking truth when you're enslaved property can be more dangerous than any lie. But now truth was forcing its way into the world whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. The second-floor hallway felt claustrophobic, the walls seeming to press inward as Helene climbed the stairs. Oil lamps had been lit in Genevieve's cell, casting harsh light that made the small space feel both exposed and suffocating. The heat was unbearable. Louisiana October still carried summer's weight, and the small room had no ventilation beyond a single window that looked out onto nothing but darkness and Spanish moss. Sister Genevieve lay on sheets already soaked through, her hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes wild with pain and terror. Mother Superior stood at the foot of the bed, her face carved from stone, her hands gripping her rosary so tightly the beads had left marks in her palms. Helene didn't waste time with questions. She delivered over 100 babies in the slave quarters across 4 decades. She knew what needed doing. "Get me clean linens," she commanded, her voice carrying authority that momentarily erased the fact that she was addressing women who technically owned her. "Boiled water, string, a sharp knife, and all of you except Mother Superior, out. This room's too small for spectators." Sister Angelique hesitated. "But we should. Out." Helene's tone left no room for argument. The door closed, leaving only Helene, Mother Superior, and Genevieve in the small cell. The sounds that followed would haunt both women for the remainder of their lives. Genevieve's nails scraped against the wooden bed frame, leaving marks in the soft pine. Her screams, when they came, were muffled by wadded cloth shoved between her teeth, but they still carried enough force to vibrate through the walls. In other cells, sisters lay awake, clutching their own pregnant bellies, knowing their turn would come in weeks or months, understanding that the future they'd all been dreading had finally arrived. The labor progressed with the grinding inevitability of a natural process that cared nothing for vows or sacred space, or the elaborate fictions humans constructed to pretend they existed outside biology's domain. Helene worked with the calm competence of experience, her hands knowing what to do even as her mind reeled at the impossibility of doing it here. For this woman, in this place that was supposed to exist beyond such earthly concerns. "Push," she commanded when the time came. "Push now, sister. Your body knows what to do even if your vows say it shouldn't." The candlelight flickered, as if the flames themselves were disturbed by what they were witnessing. Shadows danced across the whitewashed walls in patterns that seemed almost alive, dark shapes that writhed and twisted like physical manifestations of the scandal being born in this room. And then, just after midnight, in that liminal hour when one day dies and another struggles into being, the child arrived. A girl, slick with birth fluids, impossibly small, her lungs filling with air for the first time as she released a cry that was pure and uncomplicated, and completely unaware of the catastrophe her existence represented. Helene caught the infant with practiced hands, severed the cord, wiped the baby's face clean. And as she did, she saw what Mother Superior had already seen, what no amount of prayer or denial could erase. The child's features were a perfect blend. Genevieve's delicate bone structure around the eyes. But the nose, the shape of the forehead, the golden brown tone of skin that would never pass for fully white, those came from Matthias. From the man who lived in isolation at the property's edge. From the only man who'd had access to these consecrated women who were supposed to exist beyond the reach of male presence. Mother Superior's rosary clattered to the floor, beads scattering across the wooden planks like drops of blood. Sister Genevieve, exhausted beyond measure, reached for her daughter with trembling arms. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the room, a transformation that went beyond the physical facts of birth. The baby's first breath seemed to crack open a silence that had been carefully maintained for months, releasing secrets that would spread like poison through every corner of sacred mercy. Helene wrapped the infant in a piece of torn bedsheet, the closest thing to swaddling available. She placed the bundle in Genevieve's arms and stepped back, her work complete but her understanding of its implications only beginning. Outside the cell, in the hallway, 5 pregnant sisters stood in their night shifts, their hands unconsciously resting on their own swelling bellies. They'd heard the screams. They'd heard the baby's first cry. And now they stood in the terrible knowledge that what had just happened to Sister Genevieve would happen to each of them in turn, that the chain of consequence they'd set in motion through their encounters with Matthias could not be stopped, only endured. At the far end of the property, in his small cabin hidden behind the screen of live oaks, Matthias sat on his narrow porch. He hadn't heard the screams, the distance was too great, the night insects too loud. But he felt something change in the air, some shift in the weight of the darkness that pressed down on Sacred Mercy. He'd known this moment would come, had been waiting for it with the same resignation he'd learned to apply to every aspect of his existence as property. He was 23 years old. He could read and write. He understood consequences better than most of the people who claimed to own him. And he knew with absolute certainty that the child born tonight would not be the last. Inside the convent, Mother Superior Therese Barron stood at Genevieve's window, staring out at the darkness, her mind racing through possibilities and finding only catastrophes. Behind her, the young mother whispered to her daughter, words of love and terror and desperate prayer, all mixed together in the kind of incoherent babble that new mothers speak in those first moments of overwhelming recognition that they've created something that will outlive any attempt to contain it. Helene gathered the soiled linens, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew what happened next would determine whether this scandal remained buried or exploded into public knowledge. She knew powerful people would make powerful decisions. And she knew that the people with the least power, herself, Matthias, and the innocent child now nursing at Genevieve's breast, would pay the highest price regardless of how those decisions fell. The candles burned lower. The oil lamps guttered. And somewhere in the distance, the first birds began their pre-dawn chorus, announcing the arrival of a day that would find Sacred Mercy irrevocably changed. From that night forward, Sacred Mercy would never again belong to silence. The truth had been born, and like all living things, it would grow and move, and eventually refuse to be contained by any amount of institutional power or desperate prayer. By Christmas of 1846, 6 babies had been born within the convent walls. Sacred Mercy had transformed into something its founder never imagined, a place where the canonical hours competed with infant cries, where the smell of incense mixed with sour milk, where women who'd renounced motherhood found themselves pacing narrow cells at 2 in the morning, rocking bundles that refused to be soothed by prayer alone. Sister Marie Claire delivered her son 3 days after Genevieve. The labor came fast and brutal, leaving her weak for weeks afterward. The boy had Matthias's broad forehead and her own pale green eyes, a combination that made denial impossible even for those still clinging to alternative explanations. Sister Angelique followed in early November with a girl whose golden-brown skin glowed in the candlelight like polished oak. Then Sister Therese Celine in late December, screaming through a breech birth that nearly killed her, emerging with a daughter who bore Matthias's high cheekbones and quiet intensity even in the first hours of life. Each birth followed the same pattern. Helene summoned in darkness. Sisters huddled in hallways, listening to screams they tried to muffle with pillows pressed against doors. The smell of blood and sweat and fear thick enough to taste. And then the first cry, that innocent sound that announced new life completely unaware it had been born into scandal. The convent's routine crumbled under the weight of practical necessity. How could Sister Marie-Therese maintain silence during terce when her daughter needed feeding? How could Sister Genevieve focus on teaching when her breasts ached with milk and her arms felt empty without the weight of her child? The rigid structure that had governed their days for years bent and warped around the undeniable needs of infants who cared nothing for vows or discipline or the elaborate fictions adults constructed to manage their shame. Mother Superior tried to enforce order through sheer force of will. She assigned feeding schedules that aligned with breaks between canonical hours. She designated a single room on the 3rd floor as a makeshift nursery where the babies could be contained during prayers. She forbade the sisters from speaking their children's names aloud, as if refusing to name them might somehow reduce their reality. But babies are anarchists by nature. They cry when hungry, regardless of whether it's time for sext. They soil themselves during vespers. They wake screaming at 3 in the morning, demanding attention with a tyranny no mother superior could match. And the sisters, these women who'd spent years training themselves to exist above earthly attachments, discovered that biology cared nothing for their theological commitments. Sister Angelique found herself humming lullabies she didn't remember learning, her body moving in ancient rhythms of maternal comfort that predated Christianity itself. Sister Marie Claire spent hours studying her son's tiny fingers, counting and recounting them as if the mathematics of his perfection might somehow absolve the circumstances of his creation. Even those who hadn't yet delivered felt the shift. Sister Marguerite, 7 months pregnant and moving like a ship under full sail, would press her hands against her swelling belly and feel the child inside her kick with the same fierce insistence on existence that characterized all the others. She was carrying Matthias's child. There was no point pretending otherwise. And despite everything she'd been taught about sin and consequence, she couldn't force herself to hate the life growing inside her. The convent had become a place where competing truths existed in constant tension. They were consecrated religious bound by vows that remained technically intact. They were also mothers, with all the fierce protective instinct that role awakened. They had committed sacrilege of the highest order. They had also created life. Both things were simultaneously true, and neither could be dissolved by prayer or penance. Through it all, Matthias continued his work with the same silent efficiency he'd always displayed. He chopped wood while babies wailed in the distance. He repaired the chapel roof while women who'd shared his bed struggled through labor 300 yards away. He tended gardens where vegetables grew according to natural law, unconcerned with the moral chaos unfolding in the building that cast its shadow across the furrows. Did he think about the children? Did he wonder which infant's cry belonged to which sister? Did he feel anything beyond the careful numbness that survival as property required? No one asked. No one dared. He remained what he'd always been, a ghost who performed necessary labor, visible only when his function required acknowledgement. But the sisters noticed small things. The way he worked more slowly near the building when babies could be heard crying, as if some part of him strained to hear those voices that carried his genetic legacy. The wooden toys that began appearing near the kitchen door, simple carved figures of animals, left anonymously but unmistakably crafted by his skilled hands. The extra firewood stacked by the nursery window during cold snaps, ensuring the room stayed warm even when other parts of the building ran short. Small gestures from a man who'd been denied the right to claim fatherhood openly, who existed in a legal and moral category that made his relationship to these children simultaneously undeniable and completely invalid. By August of 1848, all 12 had been born. The last was Sister Angelique's son, delivered on the Feast of the Assumption with a speed that left everyone unprepared. He arrived so quickly that only Mother Superior and one other sister were present, the baby crowning before Helene could even be summoned from the kitchen. He emerged into the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce not just his own arrival but the completion of something, a terrible cycle that had finally, mercifully, reached its end. 12 women, 12 children, all fathered by the same man over a span of 3 years. The mathematics of it were staggering. The theological implications even more so. Mother Superior stood at her window one evening in late August, watching the sun sink behind the cypress trees, painting everything the color of old blood. Behind her, in the makeshift nursery, 12 infants and toddlers created a cacophony that made contemplation impossible. Some slept. Others cried. A few had begun to toddle, their small hands reaching for objects they had no names for yet, their voices producing sounds that would eventually become words. She'd spent 3 decades building a life of order and devotion. She believed absolutely in the power of discipline to create sanctuary from the world's chaos. But that belief lay in ruins around her, buried under soiled swaddling and the stubborn reality of children who would not be prayed away or wished into non-existence. The situation could no longer be hidden. Too many variables now existed outside her control. The children were growing. They would develop personalities, would eventually speak, would require explanations for their circumstances that no fiction could adequately provide. Monsieur Guidry had already noticed changes months ago. Others would follow. Questions would be asked that couldn't be deflected with vague references to illness or climate. The weight of what came next pressed down on Mother Superior's shoulders until she thought her spine might crack. She'd protected her community for as long as protection was possible. But that time had ended. She turned from the window and looked at the rosary in her hands. The same rosary she'd carried since taking her final vows 3 decades prior. She'd believed it connected her to something eternal and unchanging. Now it felt like just another object, wood and wire and human construction, possessing no power beyond what desperate people projected onto it. Sacred mercy had been transformed from a place of devotion into a testament to human frailty. And Mother Superior Therese Barron understood with perfect clarity that shielding this truth from outside eyes was no longer within her capability. The reckoning was coming. The only question was what form it would take. The summons came on a January morning in 1847, delivered by Sister Angelique with eyes that couldn't meet his. Mother Superior wishes to speak with you. In her office. Now. Matthias set down the axe he'd been using to split firewood. He'd been expecting this conversation for months, had felt it approaching with the same inevitability as winter following autumn. He wiped his hands on his trousers, the rough fabric already stained with the evidence of labor that never ended, and followed Sister Angelique across the grounds toward the main building. It was the first time he'd entered that structure since being moved to the cabin at the property's edge. The hallway felt different from inside, narrower than he remembered, the air heavy with the smell of bodies and milk and something else he couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe. Or fear thick enough to leave residue on the walls. Mother Superior's office was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a crucifix on the wall that dominated the space with its suffering bronze figure. She stood with her back to him, looking out the window at the gardens where much of what led to this moment had begun. "Sit," she said without turning. He remained standing. Property doesn't presume to take furniture meant for people. She finally turned to face him, and he saw exhaustion etched so deeply into her features it looked like erosion. She'd aged a decade in the 2 years since he'd been purchased for this property. Her hair had gone almost entirely gray. Her hands trembled slightly even when clasped together. "You understand the gravity of what has occurred here." It wasn't a question. The same opening she'd used the last time they'd spoken directly, back when only 1 child had been born and the full scope of the catastrophe remained unclear. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "These women took vows before God. Sacred vows. They renounced the world, the flesh, all earthly attachments." Her voice gained strength as she moved through familiar theological territory. "What has happened here is not merely sin, it is sacrilege of the highest order. It threatens everything this community represents. Everything the Church stands for in this region." Matthias said nothing. What response could he possibly offer? That he'd been as much instrument as participant? That consent wasn't a concept that applied to property? That every encounter had been initiated by women who held absolute power over his existence, who could have him beaten or sold or killed if he'd refused their advances? None of those truths would matter to the woman standing before him. Her concern wasn't justice, it was containment. Managing a crisis that threatened her authority and the institution she devoted her life to serving. 6 children have been born, she continued, though they both knew the number would reach 12 before the cycle completed. 6 more are expected. The Church cannot know of this. The diocese cannot know. If word reaches New Orleans, if the Archbishop learns what has transpired here, this convent will be closed. The sisters will be defrocked and cast out in disgrace. And the Church itself will suffer a blow to its moral authority that could take generations to repair. She paused, studying him with eyes that held no warmth but, strangely, no hatred either. Just calculation. The cold assessment of someone solving a problem that happened to be shaped like a human being. You cannot remain visible on this property, she said finally. Your presence is a constant reminder of our shame. You will move to the cabin at the far edge of the grounds. You will continue your work, but you will do so at night or in early morning hours before the sisters emerge for lauds. You will make yourself invisible unless specifically summoned for tasks that cannot wait. The wooden clock on her desk ticked in the silence that followed. Somewhere upstairs, a baby began to cry, thin and insistent, the sound cutting through the walls like accusation. Do you understand the position you occupy? Mother Superior asked, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. You are simultaneously the instrument of our ruin, and the only witness whose testimony must never be heard. Matthias understood perfectly. He'd always understood. From the first moment Sister Marie-Therese had approached him in the tool shed with need and power and desire, all mixed together in a combination he'd had no ability to refuse. He'd understood that whatever happened, whatever consequences emerged from those encounters, he would bear the blame while possessing none of the authority. Yes, ma'am, he said again. The only safe response available to him. Mother Superior's shoulders sagged slightly, as if his compliance had been the last structural support holding her upright. You may go. Collect your belongings from the tool shed. Margot will show you to the cabin. He turned to leave, his hand on the door handle, when her voice stopped him. Matthias. He paused but didn't turn around. Did you? She struggled for words, searching for a question that might yield some understanding of how this had happened. Did you ever? Did any of them force themselves upon you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Behind it lay a desperate hope that he might provide some explanation that would shift blame, that would make what had happened his fault through action, rather than their fault through failure of discipline. But the truth was more complicated than that question allowed. Force was too simple a word for what had occurred. The sisters had initiated. They'd sought him out. They'd exercised power over someone who possessed none. But force. The word implied violence, coercion, physical dominance. What had happened was subtler and more insidious than that. The inevitable result of putting absolute power in proximity to someone who could be disposed of without consequence if they refused to comply. No, ma'am, he said finally. Because that answer served everyone's purposes better than honesty would. They didn't force me. He left before she could ask anything else, walking down the hallway past rooms where women he'd known in the most intimate possible way now avoided his gaze with the same thoroughness they'd once sought it out. Past the nursery where children who carried his features slept or cried, or stared at the ceiling with eyes that would eventually learn to see him without recognizing what they were looking at. Outside, the air felt cleaner. He paused on the gallery, breathing deeply, watching dust motes swirl in the morning light. Behind a second-floor curtain, Sister Jean-Baptiste watched him leave. Her hand pressed against the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. She was 4 months pregnant, her body just beginning to show the changes that would make her condition undeniable in a few more weeks. She'd been the sixth to break her vows with Matthias. The sixth to seek him out in the tool shed after hearing whispered confessions from the others. She'd approached him not with passion but with terrible curiosity, wanting to understand what had driven her sisters to violate everything they'd professed to believe. What she'd discovered was worse than simple lust. She'd found a man who treated her gently despite having every reason to hate all of them, who spoke softly and asked if she was certain, who'd made her feel, for the first time in her religious life, like an actual person rather than a symbol of devotion. And that gentleness had been more devastating than cruelty would have been, because it made him real in ways that property wasn't supposed to be real. It made what they were doing to him, collectively, systematically, impossible to pretend was anything other than abuse of power dressed up in the language of transgression. She watched him walk toward the cypress grove, his shoulders straight despite everything, his pace unhurried. Watched until the trees swallowed him, and he disappeared into the isolation that would be his life for however long Mother Superior decided he could remain useful. Her hand fell from the glass. She turned back to her cell, to her prayer book and her secret writing, and the growing certainty that silence in the face of this injustice would be a greater sin than any they'd already committed. Matthias reached the cabin as full morning arrived. It was small, barely 8 feet square, with a narrow cot, a single chair, a table that wobbled on uneven legs. No window. A door that didn't quite seal against the elements. He set down his belongings and sat on the cot, feeling the ropes beneath the thin mattress sag under his weight. This was his reward for compliance. Isolation so complete that days might pass without him speaking a single word aloud. Work performed in darkness, his existence acknowledged only when function required it. He thought about the children he'd fathered. 12 of them, eventually. 12 lives that carried his blood but would never know his name. 12 futures that might flourish or fail based entirely on where Mother Superior placed them and how much money changed hands to ensure their silence. And he thought about the sisters, these women who'd had everything and thrown it away in moments of weakness or curiosity or desperate human need. Women who'd used him and would now spend their lives pretending he didn't exist. He felt many things in that moment. Anger, resignation, a strange kind of grief for something that had never really existed in the first place. But mostly, he felt tired. Bone-deep exhaustion that came from being simultaneously invisible and the center of everything. From bearing blame without possessing agency. From understanding that his fate had never been his to control and never would be. He lay back on the cot and stared at the rough boards of the ceiling, trying to prepare himself for whatever came next, knowing that isolation might be the smallest consequence of what already lay behind him. The first child left Sacred Mercy on a February night in 1847, wrapped in blankets and carried in the arms of a woman who'd been paid $200 to tell people she was the infant's grandmother. Sister Genevieve watched from her cell window as the carriage pulled away, its wheels crunching on the shell road that turned to mud this time of year. Her daughter, she'd secretly named her Celeste, though Mother Superior had forbidden the use of names, disappeared into darkness, headed for a family in New Orleans who'd been told the child was an orphan from a convent in France. A fiction that would become her entire identity. Genevieve had begged to keep something. A lock of the baby's dark hair. The small wooden rattle Matthias had carved and left anonymously by the nursery door. Even the blanket she'd been wrapped in at birth, still carrying her scent. Mother Superior had refused everything. Attachments prolong suffering, she'd said with the flat certainty of someone who'd never given birth, never felt the physical tearing that accompanied separation from a child your body still recognized as part of itself. Clean breaks heal faster. But breaks don't heal when pieces of you remain missing. Sister Genevieve stood at that window until the carriage lights disappeared completely, until there was nothing left to see but darkness and the vague shapes of trees against a moonless sky. Then she collapsed onto her narrow bed and wept with a violence that left her gasping, her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle sounds that would have woken the entire convent if released at full volume. The dispersal followed a careful pattern over the next 18 months. Each child was placed with a different family, in a different city, with a different fabricated backstory. Some went to New Orleans, wealthy Creole families who wanted children but couldn't produce them naturally. Others traveled to Baton Rouge, Mobile, Natchez. One girl ended up as far away as Charleston, South Carolina, her light skin allowing her to pass completely into white society if she never asked too many questions about her origins. Mother Superior conducted the negotiations with the cold efficiency of a businesswoman. She met with potential families in neutral locations, hotels in New Orleans, private parlors in Baton Rouge. She interviewed them about their Catholic faith, their financial stability, their willingness to maintain absolute secrecy about the adoption. Money changed hands. Donations to the convent in exchange for children who came with elaborate stories but no legal documentation. Some families asked uncomfortable questions. Where exactly had these children come from? Why were there so many available for adoption from a single convent? What circumstances had led to their mother's inability to keep them? Mother Superior had prepared answers that walked the line between plausibility and unverifiable detail. The children were from various circumstances, illegitimate offspring of wealthy planters seeking to protect family reputations, orphans from convents in France that had closed during political upheavals, products of tragic situations where mothers had died in childbirth leaving no family to claim the infants. The lies came easier each time she told them. Practice smoothed the rough edges, made the fictions sound natural rather than rehearsed. But each placement exacted its price from the sisters who'd carried these children. Sister Marie Claire collapsed into fever after her son was taken, burning with temperatures that left her delirious for 3 days, calling for a child who'd been carried away in the night to a family in Baton Rouge who believed they were rescuing an orphan from tragic circumstances. Sister Angelique scratched her arms raw in the weeks after her daughter left, leaving scars that she'd carry for the rest of her life. She'd tried to keep a small cloth rabbit she'd sewn from scraps during her pregnancy, something her hands had made for the child who'd grown inside her. Mother Superior had found it hidden in her cell and burned it in the kitchen fireplace while Angelique watched, tears streaming down her face in silent protest. "You are brides of Christ," Mother Superior reminded them during a chapter meeting after the 4th child had been sent away. "Your attachment was to God alone. These children were consequences of sin, not objects of legitimate affection. Grief is natural, but prolonged mourning suggests you haven't truly repented." But biology doesn't care about theology. Bodies that had spent 9 months preparing to nurture specific infants don't simply forget when those infants are removed. Milk still came, painful and useless, requiring the sisters to bind their breasts tightly until the flow finally stopped. Hormones that had flooded their systems during pregnancy and birth now crashed, leaving them vulnerable to moods that swung wildly between despair and numbness. And the dreams, those were worst of all. Every sister who'd given up a child reported the same experience. Waking in the night certain they'd heard crying, rushing to the nursery only to find it empty except for the children who hadn't yet been placed. The phantom cries continued for months, maybe years. Some sisters learned to sleep through them. Others never did. By August of 1848, when the last child, Sister Angelique's second baby, a boy born on the Feast of the Assumption, was placed with a family in Natchez, the nursery had been emptied. The cribs dismantled. The cloth diapers burned. Every physical trace of what had occurred removed with systematic thoroughness. The convent returned to its strict schedule. Matins at 4:30. Lauds at sunrise. The canonical hours proceeding with clockwork regularity, as if the previous 3 years had been a fever dream rather than flesh and blood reality. But the emotional atmosphere had been permanently altered. The sisters moved through their duties with mechanical precision, but something vital had been extracted from them. They prayed the words they'd always prayed, but the prayers felt hollow now, sounds produced by muscle memory rather than genuine devotion. Sister Marie-Therese, who'd been the first to break her vows, developed a habit of staring at her empty hands during meals, as if searching for something she couldn't quite remember losing. Sister Marguerite stopped speaking entirely for 6 months after her daughter was sent away, communicating only through nods and head shakes until Mother Superior finally ordered her to confess or face expulsion. And on certain nights, when wind moved through the cypress trees in ways that almost sounded like infant cries, several sisters would wake simultaneously, sitting up in their narrow beds, listening to echoes of voices that would never again call them mother. The children were gone, scattered across the south like seeds from a plant that should never have flowered, each one carrying genetic evidence of scandal in their features, in their coloring, in traits that would emerge unpredictably in future generations. Unexplained light eyes in families whose eyes had always been dark, unusual height appearing without ancestry to support it, temperaments that seemed to come from nowhere, but actually came from a man named Matthias who'd lived in isolation on a convent's edge and never been allowed to claim his own children. Sacred mercy returned to silence. But it was a different silence than before, heavier, haunted by what had been removed rather than elevated by what remained. The sisters had learned something the Church never taught them, that some wounds don't heal when you extract what caused them. Sometimes, removal just makes the emptiness more obvious. Sister Jean-Baptiste had always been the intellectual among them. Before taking her vows, she'd been the daughter of a notary in Lafayette, a woman who read Latin poetry for pleasure, who kept detailed journals of her spiritual development, who'd been considered almost dangerously educated for a female in 1830s Louisiana. She'd entered religious life not because she'd failed at secular existence but because she genuinely believed contemplative devotion represented the highest possible use of an intelligent mind. That belief had survived her vows, her years of service, even the breaking of those vows with Matthias in the tool shed on an autumn afternoon that now felt like it had happened to someone else. What finally shattered that belief was watching Sister Angelique collapse into silent grief after her second child was carried away. Watching Sister Marie-Claire scratch at her arms until they bled. Witnessing the systematic erasure of 12 children from existence as if they'd never been born, as if the suffering their mothers endured could be managed through institutional denial. In the spring of 1850, 2 years after the last birth, Sister Jean-Baptiste began to write. She did so in her cell, late at night, after Compline when the Great Silence had officially begun and the other sisters had withdrawn to their own rooms. She worked by the light of a single candle, positioned carefully so its glow wouldn't show under her door. The flame flickered with each breath she took, making shadows dance across the pages of a journal she'd kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She wrote in Latin, not because it was her most comfortable language, that would have been French, but because Latin was the universal language of the Church. If this account was ever to reach those with power to act, it needed to speak in terms they couldn't dismiss as provincial or colloquial. Her quill scratched against paper with a sound like mice moving through walls. Each stroke of ink required care. Too much pressure and the nib would tear the page, too little and the words would be illegible. She'd taught herself to write with minimal waste, her script small and precise, packing maximum information into minimum space. In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. I, Sister Jean-Baptiste of the Convent of the Sacred Mercy, do hereby attest to events that have transpired within these walls between the years 1845 and 1848. She documented everything. The names of all 12 sisters who'd participated. the approximate dates of each encounter with Matthias, insofar as she could reconstruct them from whispered confessions and observation. The births, their sequence, their circumstances, the features of each child that made paternity undeniable. The disposition of the infants, where each had been sent, which families had received them, the amounts of money that had changed hands. But more than just facts, she tried to capture the psychological reality of what had occurred. How Sister Marie-Therese had been the first, how her confession to Sister Angelique had started the pattern. How each sister's transgression had somehow made the next seem less impossible. How they'd created elaborate theological justifications that let them pretend Matthias's enslaved status placed their encounters in some category exempt from normal prohibitions. She wrote with clinical detachment about her own participation, describing how she'd sought out Matthias not from lust but from terrible curiosity. How she'd wanted to understand what had driven the others. How that curiosity had been its own form of sin, treating another human being as an experiment in moral philosophy rather than a person deserving basic dignity. We told ourselves stories, she wrote. We said he was not fully a man because the law defined him as property. We said our vows did not apply because he existed outside the social categories where those vows made sense. We said many things to avoid saying the truth, that we had power and we used it, and he had none and could not refuse us without risking his life. The candle burned lower. Wax dripped onto the simple wooden desk, forming small pools that hardened into white discs. She scraped them away absently, her attention focused entirely on the manuscript growing beneath her hands. Outside her cell, the convent slept, or pretended to sleep. She could hear occasional sounds through the walls. A bed creaking as someone shifted position. The muffled sob of Sister Marguerite, who still wept most nights despite it being 2 years since her daughter's departure. The faint scratch of mice or rats moving through the spaces between floors. And underneath everything, the constant presence of Louisiana itself. Insects buzzing, frogs calling from the swamp, the wet breathing of a landscape that never truly rested. Sister Jean-Baptiste wrote for 3 hours that first night, her hand cramping until she had to pause and flex her fingers to restore circulation. When she finally stopped, she had 7 pages of dense Latin script. 7 pages that, if discovered, would result in her immediate expulsion from the convent, possibly her excommunication, potentially her commitment to an asylum for lunatics. But she didn't stop. Night after night, she continued the work, building a comprehensive account of what had happened at Sacred Mercy, creating a record that couldn't be dismissed as hysterical raving or unreliable testimony. She included dates, names, specific details that could be verified by anyone willing to investigate. She named the priests who'd helped facilitate adoptions. She referenced specific bank transactions from the convent's accounts. She provided, in essence, a roadmap that any serious investigator could follow to confirm every element of the scandal. She was creating insurance. Evidence that would make silencing the truth more difficult, if not impossible. But she was also creating something else, a confession that the Church's formal sacrament couldn't accommodate. Because confession required absolution from a priest, and what priest could absolve what they'd done? What penance could possibly address the magnitude of their transgression? How many Hail Marys equaled 12 children scattered across the South, growing up without knowledge of their origins? The formal structures of Catholic guilt and redemption had no mechanism for processing what had occurred at Sacred Mercy. So Sister Jean-Baptiste was inventing one, building it out of Latin grammar and documentary precision, and the stubborn belief that truth mattered more than institutional preservation. She wrote about Matthias with particular care, describing his isolation, his quiet competence, the small kindnesses he'd shown despite having every reason to hate them all, the wooden toys that appeared by the nursery door, the extra firewood during cold snaps. The gentle way he'd treated each sister during their encounters, asking permission even though permission was a fiction when the person asking possessed absolute power over the person being asked. "He is," she wrote, "the most innocent party in this entire catastrophe. And he is the one who will suffer most if the truth emerges, because he possesses neither the social standing to defend himself nor the institutional protection we enjoy. Justice would demand his freedom and our punishment. But I fear justice is not what will be delivered if this scandal reaches those with power to judge." Footsteps in the hallway outside froze her mid-sentence. She held her breath, listening as someone passed her door. Mother Superior, probably, making her nightly rounds to ensure all sisters were properly confined to their cells. The footsteps paused. Sister Jean-Baptiste's heart hammered so hard she was certain it could be heard through the wooden door. Then the footsteps continued, fading down the hallway and descending the stairs. She let out her breath slowly, waiting for her pulse to return to normal. Then she carefully blotted the page she'd been working on, ensuring the ink was dry before adding it to the growing stack. She wrapped the entire manuscript in oilcloth, protection against the humidity that could make paper mold within days in Louisiana's climate. She tucked the bundle into the lining of her prayer book, using small stitches to secure it in place where casual inspection wouldn't detect it. The work was far from finished. She estimated she needed at least another 10 pages to document everything comprehensively. But what she had already was enough to create serious problems for anyone who wanted this scandal buried. She extinguished her candle, plunging the cell into darkness broken only by faint moonlight filtering through her small window. She knelt beside her bed for evening prayers, but the words felt different now. She wasn't just praying. She was preparing. Building a weapon out of truth that she hoped she'd never need to use but was determined to have ready if justice required it. Outside, in his cabin at the edge of the property, Matthias lay awake as well. He didn't know about Sister Jean-Baptiste's manuscript. Didn't know someone was documenting his existence with such careful attention. But he felt something shifting. Some change in the air that suggested the careful silence Mother Superior had constructed around their shared secret might not hold forever. He stared at the rough boards of his ceiling and wondered what came next. Wondered if freedom was even possible for someone like him, or if he'd spend the rest of his life in varying forms of captivity, always defined by others, never permitted to claim his own story. In her cell, Sister Jean-Baptiste tucked her prayer book under her pillow and lay down, still dressed in her habit because undressing required more energy than she possessed. She'd begun something dangerous. Something that might destroy the church's standing in Louisiana if it reached the wrong, or perhaps the right hands. But for the first time since her daughter had been carried away into the night 2 years prior, she felt like she was doing something that mattered more than survival. She was creating a record, ensuring that what happened at Sacred Mercy couldn't be completely erased, no matter how hard powerful people tried. The truth was being written. And once written, it would be very hard to unwrite.